Hi, welcome to the episode. My guest today is Kerchanin Allen. She has spent the last 10 years working as a marketing expert, implementing comprehensive marketing strategies for organizations in the healthcare space. She's got some great insights and tips on for people in her shoes and also for people in the healthcare industry. Let's take a listen. Kerchanin, thank you for coming on board and having a conversation with me. I'm looking forward to talking about your experience and your journey in marketing in the healthcare world. So fill me in. Tell me what you've been doing and some of the interesting areas you've been practicing in.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be on. Healthcare industry is one of those industries that's constantly changing. And for a marketer, that's really fun. I've been doing this for about 10 years and some change in the healthcare space, and have been fortunate enough to have a lot of different experiences. So I've been at the payer level, I've done some utilization management, I've done some care coordination and continuum stuff, and most recently was working with high needs ACO REACH, which those are very, very interesting and a lot to learn. It's almost purely Medicare. It's the top 5% sickest population, but they account for the top 50-60% of spend. So it's definitely a group of people who need help and need representation, and to be able to have worked with that level of intensity in the healthcare space is really special to me. It's meaningful to be making change in people's lives and not just marketing overall,
Well, it's interesting. The healthcare industry, I think, for most people that I've spoken to anyways, is that their first wish is to provide some sort of positive outcome for patients, for people having problems. It's kind of where people go into it. And then at some point they sort of navigate and move around and then go, oh, you know what? Actually, I want to be over here doing this. And they move from like science or medicine over to business management or strategy or marketing. So it's kind of cool that, it can attract a lot of people from a variety of different initial interest, but then you find your way into the system and find your happy place, right?
Absolutely.
So, I mean, how did you plan on moving into healthcare? I mean, you started in you did your training in marketing and that. So take me from there, and then how did you end up in healthcare?
I actually took a path that's somewhat similar to a lot of marketers in our space, but a little bit funny sounding at the forefront. When you look at it, I was in graduate school for journalism. Actually, I was doing editorial journalism and fancied myself a war reporter for like 5 minutes.
Oh, wow.
And I actually did a really cool program where we went overseas. We followed Ernie Pyle's path during World War II and visited all the places that he sent major reports from, which was really exciting and helped me realize that's not what I wanted to do. So I leaned a little bit more into the editorial side. I learned a lot of hard technical skills in the second year of my graduate program and leaned a little bit more into the storytelling aspect of things, which when you start doing brand marketing, it's really important that you're able to understand and really dig out a story from data, from individual accounts of what the company does, from experiences that you're able to be one-on-one with the people who are working with you. So it's nice to have that background and be able to kind of find stories in places where maybe people are like, what? There's no story here. It's just, it is what it is, I'm like, yeah, but have you considered this? And then, you go off on
There's
some
always
tangent.
something more than
like,
face value, right? Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. There's more to it. Yeah. So when I graduated from my graduate program, I actually did some morning reports for NPR. I was like doing the water main reporting, like sitting in on the city council.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, it was very like slow moving stories, but I thought it was like the coolest thing ever. And
of course, yeah.
I did a little bit of freelance work actually right out of school, and I did some stuff with mostly web design and actually like marketing tech stuff. So things that people needed help with, writing skills that I had from J school, all those types of things. And started to figure out that, I probably needed to specialize a little bit. So
right.
When I moved to Chicago, I actually was fortunate enough to be set on top of the social media manager's pile of resumes for Healthcare Service Corporation. His name's Ullman. He's a nice guy, really good boss. But I remember when I first started there, he was like, actually, I pulled your resume because I really wanted to ask you about your name. And he's like, among other reasons, but I was really curious. And I was like, okay, cool. So I said a little thanks to Grandma. Yeah.
There's something about having unusual names. It does get people's attention.
It does. So kudos to my parents for helping me out there. But yeah, so that was kind of my first gig in healthcare. It's a huge payer space. There's a ton to learn. There's 5 entities that make up HCSC. So I was busy, and I was working on, they had just launched the Connect community there, which is a really interesting online platform for patients and I would say and providers and their families. And I think recently they've added the Medicare space to it also. Oh, wow. But it's still alive and thriving. It sort of started as a blog and became more of an educational resource tool and engagement tool. Mm-hmm. And the time I was there, I had the fortunate opportunity to kind of work with a lot of really good writers in that company. So I learned a lot from them and started to think about maybe getting a little bit more niche. I felt like I was fairly separated from the patient experience, and that was not necessarily where I wanted the rest of my career to be. So I got more and more niche as we went along. And, now I'm basically patient level, helping people to tell their story to patients and their caregivers, helping people to kind of put together their brand identity in the voice that is most appropriate for them. I help people out with sort of strategic thinking and operationalization around what their company needs as far as marketing, because sometimes what you think you need and what foundations you have don't quite match. So I always make sure that they have like the right foundations set up in order for their projects to succeed. And that's just been a really fun adventure for me.
That's really cool. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I mean, it's case study. The case study concept is, it's an expanded version of a testimonial. I mean, they have so much value, when trying to introduce a product or a brand to an audience that never heard of it before. I mean, the case study is a great way to do it, especially if you can get it to be a very genuine delivery, right? Which isn't always easy when you're talking to somebody who's never been on camera before, never had a microphone in front of them. And, to get that real genuine story out of them, because I mean, no one's ever going to put out a bad case study. So, of course, everyone's going to.
I mean, unless you're Wendy's and you're trying to make a point, right? Like that.
True enough.
Well, and it's hard too in our industry that, the people I work with are very elderly. So getting testimonials from somebody who's got, multiple comorbidities and they're 97 and they're in a long-term custodial care facility. I mean, you're probably not going to get a very clear story from them. So it's sometimes easier to talk to families or talk to their physician. And it gets a little bit complicated, but it's an important story to tell.
Absolutely. So that's kind of where your focus has been in the last little while then is, being able to pull those stories together and deliver those.
I've been working on some individual brand identity, especially in the last company I was with. They really hadn't had kind of an organized approach to marketing yet. They've been doing a lot of project-based marketing, and they had some really successful, brand identity thanks to their private investors. They had some help there. They had a couple of contractors before me who were very talented and left me with some really good foundations. And they just needed somebody to come in and kind of pull it all together and tie the knots, so to speak. What are we missing? Where do we need a facelift? What conversations should we be having with our audiences that we're not necessarily having? So there's a lot of strategic conversation, a lot of growth-oriented conversation. I actually was on the growth team. It was not an independent marketing team. So I also learned a lot from them. Their sales, growth, and marketing was all kind of one identity in the company. Excuse me. Right. And I even worked alongside their data analytics guy who was like very talented at pulling data that told stories. So he and I got to work really closely together, and I'd be like, hey, I want something that shows me this. And he'd be like, give me an hour. And he'd come back with like all this data that basically proved either I was right or I was wrong, and we have a story to tell or we don't. And it was really great.
Oh, that's interesting. Wow.
Yeah.
What do you find in as far as marketing goes in healthcare? Where do you find it's the most difficult? Like what do you think is the biggest hurdle in that industry?
That's an interesting question. I mean,
from your experience, I'm not the entire industry, but from your perspective,
in the entire industry of marketing. No, I think in the healthcare space there is a plethora of very, very smart people, and when you're working as kind of an internal marketing entity for a company with a lot of brilliant minds, there's sort of one of two things that happen. Either there's a lot of people who understand the foundations and necessities when it comes to marketing, and they're totally on board, but like too busy, right? They've got too much going on. They maybe can't ideate with you, so you need to have kind of prepared material and present that to them. And then occasionally you run into the like, I think I need to do a little bit more education outside of what performative marketing is for them.
Right,
because
right.
most of that knowledge around marketing does look like, I know how to write thought leadership, or I know how to post on social media, but do you know why we're doing that? Do you know why there's a value add to that? Can I show you how that ties into all of the other strategies that we're launching here, and how what you're doing is really advocacy for the company outside of just doing a marketing thing? So I think for me in the past, the biggest challenge has been helping people to understand the difference between what I would call cosmetic marketing versus strategic or operationalized marketing, that there's a deeper value and a deeper meaning to the things you already know how to do well. And I love to teach people that. I think that's a really fun part of my job, because you see this like light bulb go off when you're like, I'd love to do a piece on thought leadership. And they go, yeah, absolutely. Let's do the piece. We write the abstract together. They start to write the piece and they go, you know what, this could be a series. And I'm like, this could be a series and a podcast and a news article. And they're like, oh, and you're like, you're with me now. So I love that aha moment.
Yeah.
And for me, it's somehow like both kind of a challenge, but also very exciting. The flip side to that is that there are a lot of very smart people, and sometimes they're kind of shy about showing how smart they are. Right. So you have to like convince people like, no, you should really be a voice for this. This is, and they kind of get like, well, maybe I could write something. You could just brand it as the company though. I'm like, no, I want to put your name on it.
Is that funny? Yeah, they just don't want their face attached. So they're just so shy.
I know. And I've been blessed in a way with that, because it shows that a lot of folks in this industry are very humble. They're really here for the patient well-being. They're not here to be famous and well-known. And, they really want to do good.
Right.
And I feel like there's a lot of value in that when you're trying to present somebody as kind of like a hero in the space. You're like, hey, they don't want you to know who they are, but I want you to know who they are. So here you go.
I think that's great. I like that. I like that approach. And you're right. I don't think it comes necessarily natural to a lot of people to be able to do it, whether it's writing, sure, go to write, here, I'll write something.
They're all good writers.
Yeah, they're great writers.
Yeah.
When you think about that, it's like getting so you're basically priming somebody or grooming somebody to be a sort of a spokesperson when their natural instinct is to not do that. It's to be a behind the scenes tech scientist, doing all the thinking in the backstage. But people do want to hear about them. They want to see who is behind all this stuff. And I think there's a lot of value there. And you're also talking about organizations or companies that have multiple audiences, which I think is very interesting, is that, some companies are marketing to the patient, the providers,
Yeah.
and several other stakeholders, and then investors, right? Like, and in each one of them has a different message and wants to hear something different and understands a different perspective, but yet we're
Mhm.
talking about one brand or one product, or and that's confusing, isn't it?
It can be, especially when you're looking at some of those places that have like a much longer care continuum. One example that I can give you is when you're trying to build a website, for example, your homepage needs to be really clearly oriented for your primary audience. Well, if you're a company that has multiple primary audiences, as a person building a digital footprint and really trying to develop brand identity,
Mm-hmm.
you have to be able to demonstrate in less than 3 seconds, basically, how those audiences are all important, right? So that can be challenging. And,
Mm-hmm.
and when you're presenting materials, being able to both create differentiated stories for each one of those audiences while still telling one cohesive brand story, it can be a lot to navigate. Yeah, for sure.
For sure. So when you were talking earlier, you were saying, it sounded like that your approach is a little more strategic, that you try and get these people to think a little bit more purposeful around their marketing. So give me, one strategy that you've particularly liked and enjoyed implementing when it came to marketing with a company, because they don't always buy into marketing strategies. They kind of like to throw things at the wall and see what sticks, but it's
Yeah.
nice to have something that is a little bit more thought through, right? So tell me what you think about that.
I'm a question driven person. I like to understand more kind of the impetus behind an ask for something. So for me, it's a lot easier to deliver on what's being asked of me if I can understand what you're trying to achieve. So, I've done a couple of different projects where I might be asked for, hey, I want testimonials from patients, or hey, I really want to update our website. That's probably the cleanest one, right? I really want to update our website.
I need a new website.
Every marketer's gotten that one.
Right. Yeah.
And my question, actually, there's a really recent example of this. My question was, why? What about the website now isn't working for you? And we had a conversation that kind of was like, hey, it's sort of carried over, and there were previous goals attached to some of the things that are on there, previous performance metrics that are on there. And I'm like, so I'm hearing that there's incorrect content on it, that's probably the first issue, right? Like, let's address that first.
Current content. Very important.
Yeah. And as you're kind of trying to build that story, then you say, okay, well, what's the correct numbers around this? Well, we don't know yet, because the way that Medicare releases data, it's sort of backlogged, right? So you may or may not know this, but the Medicare data comes from the previous year.
Oh, I see. Right. Yeah. Okay.
So you might be saying like, oh, our results this year, but you're talking about 2023.
Right.
Yeah. Right. And that's confusing, right? It's a confusing way to present data, but it's really the only way you can present Medicare performance, especially in like the REACH space. And REACH is a very small part of the ACO network. So it's even more like kind of specific. And when you're presenting that data, it has to be clear what you're saying, right? Because you could be talking about, being a top performer. You could be talking about specifically in, quality metrics. You could be talking about gain share. You could be talking about, so there's all types of like first place ways that you could be performing, right? So presenting that in kind of a clear and really tidy way is helpful. And these companies often do that. They do that really well. The problem is if you don't have somebody full-time monitoring that, then the numbers are wrong after a year, or like somebody has to go update that. So how can we kind of reposition that and reframe that so that you don't have to update that regularly? How can it be sort of constantly true? And let's look at the foundation that you have already that's informing that. Well, when I got into the company, there was a lot of material, right? There was like a lot of material for me to review. There was like a pitch deck. There was a previous style guide, all these other things. And none of them said the same thing. So I was like, so this is the truth here is the story, right? I need to know where are we now because I have multiple materials that say different things. And that's really telling of healthcare, right? There's a lot of data and it sometimes shows different angles of all of it being true, but it's like, which one do we want to focus on?
Right.
And so the most successful stories I find are like, let's take one of these things at a time and tell that story and then tell the next one and then tell the next one and then put them all together and tell a brand story publicly. You know, we have to work internally first to make sure that everything kind of agrees and ties together nice and clean. Mm-hmm. And then we've got a full story to tell about specifically our ACO REACH. And then, okay, well, how does that tie to our other 5 branches of the company that are active? You know, how does that tie to our med group? How does that tie to our post-acute services? Does it tie to those services? Or do we have now another marketing story that we need to tell? So I think helping to kind of differentiate what your truth is a really good place to start, especially in an industry that's as complicated as Medicare.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I mean, the whole healthcare system is complicated. I mean,
yes.
it doesn't matter what area you're in. It's all extremely complicated. And for, particularly for patients trying to navigate their own experience with their illness. Now they also have to navigate an entire industry that they've never, maybe not spent a lot of time in. So,
and there's some really fantastic companies out there that are trying to help do that. Like for example, Harmony Cares, they have a full continuum. I mean, and you try to keep people kind of moving in a straight line in services that you know are going to give them what they need, right? But there's complications that arise because of availability of services or qualifying for services. If certain patients maybe don't qualify for certain types of services because of their coverage. So it becomes more and more complicated to make sure that people are getting the care they need at the right time and in the right space.
Right. What's your favorite area in marketing that you like to hone in on? And as far as, like, I know you're talking about, you like to do the storytelling aspect, but what's your favorite way of actually delivering the stories to an audience?
There's a lot of ways to tell a story, right? And I think the most successful stories are the ones that you can tell in multiple ways and it's still interesting. So I love anything that I could do that starts, maybe it starts as a social post and we're like, wait, there's so much more to this. Let's write an article. Wait, there's so much more to this. Let's get somebody in the news. Wait, hold on a second. We should do a series on it. Wait, this needs let's do a video, let's go all the way down the line. So I would say that for me, having the opportunity to work with as many third parties as I've had the opportunity to work with and really learn from them about the creative and about the bits and bobbles that I might be missing. I've learned so much over the past, I'd even say 5 years, just working with people who are way smarter and more talented than I am in the art side of marketing. Because I'm probably a fairly decent writer. I mean, I can write words and they are typically true and the grammar's good, but the real story there is that, like, how do you elicit the mood that you want from that? And I have had just amazing opportunities to work with people who are so incredibly talented and learn kind of like, hey, there's a piece missing here and I can start to see that now when I'm telling a story. It's always about learning and growing, right? But I'm like, there's a really good video opportunity here and I totally missed it the first time. And that's probably been the most fun for me is being able to kind of collaborate with other creatives on a side of marketing that maybe is a little bit more behind the scenes, because people in companies tend to typically see like just the output and then the performance metrics. And if they're really interested, like that actual nitty gritty data that tells you how things did,
Yeah. Interesting. And I mean, it's the buyer's journey it's no secret. It's an emotional experience. It doesn't matter.
You don't what is the phrase? You don't You don't market a product, you market a feeling.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It doesn't matter if it's mascara or chemotherapy, right? Like there's
Yeah,
something that is it's unique to each individual, and it's finding
absolutely.
that secret sauce that what you're going to say is going to connect with that person who
Yeah.
actually who needs
Well, and
and
that's
wants
hard to
your product.
balance too, right? So like
Yeah,
sometimes the mood that you're selling is kind of sad.
yeah, yeah,
And it's
yeah.
especially in
Fear,
my space, you know, you're talking about people who might be on their way to hospice or people who have been in and out of the hospital for 6 or 8 months and they're not sure how they're going to do. You know, it's our goal ultimately in the past couple of companies I've worked for is to keep people out of the hospital. You know, that's not
right?
really like a fun message to sell, and you can't really like
No,
put a hospice ad in like the movie theater. That's just not that's not correct. You
right,
just don't do that.
exactly.
So it's a little bit of a juggling act in that sense of, you know, how do I sell the feeling of like relief tied to a feeling of sort of anxiety around whether or not like how's mom doing, you
Right,
know,
right.
it's tough.
Because
Yeah.
there's an emotional place where they're at, and then it's the emotional place where they want to be,
Yeah,
which
and you don't
what
want to prod the bad feeling as
right.
much. You know.
You want to relate with them, but you don't want to. Yeah, exactly. And so when
Yeah.
you're, in your experience, have you, when you've come up with this idea and said, "Oh, I think this is a great idea. We need a series." Like, do when some of these ideas, and maybe that these are initiatives that they've never actually embarked on before, do you get pushback or do you get resistance as to, well, I don't know, if that going to work, or it sounds really expensive, and like how do you pitch these ideas
Yeah.
and get a successful outcome?
I always start with two things, and actually, this is somewhat of a recent lesson that I've learned. I, in a previous life, would always kind of go to my leadership and say, like, "Hey, I've got this idea. Here's kind of the full project scope. Here's how much it'll cost." You know, you do it like how you do a project, right? Um, I've adjusted that approach somewhat, and now my project scopes are actually based on kind of more company goals. So
Mm-hmm.
if the company has released KPIs or if they've got, you know, quarterly OKRs, I'll start to tie those project scopes into those OKRs. And that
Mm-hmm.
helps to kind of
Smart.
convince people that, like, oh, this is actually like supporting something that we're trying to accomplish as a business. The flip side of that, my first stop is always compliance, especially since I work with Medicare. I call up the legal team. I try to have a good relationship with them. They are way smarter than me when it comes to understanding what is and is not going to fly. And especially if the project is going to be communicating to patients in any capacity,
Right.
I always go to them first. And I'm like, I
Right.
have this idea. And if they're like, you have lost your mind, I'm like, okay, we're just going to pass on this one for now.
Good thing I checked in with you
Yeah,
first.
if you could get compliance to say, like, I think that could work, you know, then you're like, okay, now I just need to follow their bumper guards and frame it in a business output language that people would understand. They don't need to necessarily understand all of the creative and all of the bits and bobbles that are going to go into making it work. I could worry about that and then give you a performance indicator at the end.
Right.
What you need from me is proof that it's actually valuable to get those things to perform, right? Like, why should you even care about doing that? So,
well, I mean, aligning the business goals with your activities will actually also allow you to measure the data on outcome and whether that was a successful idea or not, and then also give some sort of ROI for the company. So
well,
yeah, I
and
think
then a
that makes
second
perfect
version,
sense.
right? Because if they
Yeah.
start to update those OKRs, if they start to update their goals, you could say, we could revamp this project now and have it still support that. Let's do a version 2.
Right. Exactly.
So
yeah.
it keeps living then. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Because if you can prove that something worked, then why wouldn't they do it again? Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. So what's the biggest thing you've actually done as far as marketing initiative for somebody? Did you have you actually produced a series before?
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
So the Connect community is still thriving. That was like that was a several year project of launching that blog series.
Cool.
I actually highly recommend that for anybody who's interested in understanding the healthcare space more. They have some really good material on there that's very clearly written by people way smarter than me. And I've done several rebrands. I've done a lot of, I don't want to like name drop anything, but there's a couple companies that I've been working for have been bought within a couple years of me starting to work for them. So there's been a whole lot of change management that went into that, a lot of brand facelift and update and helping to kind of create a cohesive experience when the brands were merging. There recently, I rebuilt a website from several websites. There were like 5 websites, and I was working for a group that wanted to have one experience. So that was actually really interesting. And I learned a lot about web development from that, which, I saw I was pretty good at that. And so to have had the experience of working with kind of a third party who specialize in SEO and specialize in that capability of pulling things together that maybe are a little bit bifurcated. It's really nice to see kind of progress in my own career that way, right? So I'm starting to understand a little bit better, like, oh, maybe I didn't know how to do this as well. I should take some courses around that. Or, and then recently, almost fully operationalizing marketing objectives in a new group that had really been very contract based until now.
How have you adopted any AI or any of the new technologies that have flooded our industry over the last 5 years?
I have 2 answers for that. Which one do you want?
I'll take both.
So the industry as a whole, the marketing industry, feels both empowered and threatened by AI. And I kind of personally think
that's a very great way to say that.
I think it's really funny, actually. And I've had a conversation with a fellow kind of freelance marketing person who she's incorporated. She's a genius. She's much better at that side of it than I am. But she and I were talking about how, marketing as a whole may turn into like making AI sound less robotic in the next couple of years, and like really teaching AI how to AI better.
Yeah, I know.
So I love that side of it. I also think, I work in an industry that is very antiquated in a lot of ways. Like we still use Excel for most stuff. Like there's a lot of like old school process management when it comes to marketing and healthcare.
Right.
We're not necessarily all like already on HubSpot and all that. So, like it's just it's not part of that industry. So being able to and having the skill set, and I'll say, I recently was working for a company called Kerchanin MD. They're very with it when it comes to AI. They're aware of the value of it. They're aware of the pitfalls of it. They're protecting their data better than anyone I've seen. They're very talented in that area. They've got really skilled security. It's great people working on it, but they also had some hangups about AI. Well, we only want to use these 2 tools, and so it was interesting for me because it was the first time I'd really worked with a growth team that was like about AI, right? Usually like they're not like, hey, go use this AI tool and ask it about blah, blah, blah. And my boss there was like, just throw that into ChatGPT and see what it says. And I had never heard that as an answer to something before. And I was like, okay. So I'm like over there, and I spent probably like 4 to 5 hours that day just being like, what else can it answer? And I was like, so for me, it was a really fun learning opportunity. And it was something that I hadn't really explored because I have been working in an industry that is like a little slow to adopt, and I respect that for the sake of patient data and security, and, when you're sort of bound by HIPAA compliance, you want to be careful what you're putting into machines that are universally accessible.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
AI can be a really great, helpful tool for especially healthcare marketers, because there's all kinds of alphabet soup out there that you might just need to throw into ChatGPT and ask it what the heck that means.
Right.
Because
Right.
you could be a little bit more informed. You could write something that's a little more poignant. You could maybe get a better set of bullet points than I could write, because I'm not, I don't have a whole
Exactly.
bunch of medical degrees. And
Yeah, I like the way you brought that up, is because it's simpler things. It's like saying, well, this is the statement I want to say, but make
Mhm.
it sound less technical and more personable.
Yeah, how can I
I
make
think,
this more approachable?
yeah, like that's what I
Yeah.
found AI is really good. Well, ChatGPT particularly, is that you can actually take, a message that you want to say, but make it have a different mood, right? Have a different
Right.
feeling to
Yeah.
it. And so, it's not like, AI, I think people are dreaming of the days when AI is just going to, like, read our minds and create
It's
the
never going to
stuff, which is
happen.
great.
Yeah.
And then somebody said to me, they were like, why, why is AI taking away all the fun shit? Like, why can't AI do all the crap I don't want to do, like my
It
dishes and my
can.
laundry and fix my car? Like,
Yeah.
AI is taking away, making images and writing and making
Yeah.
videos, and
Yeah.
like that's the fun
But
stuff.
it's
That's
right.
what I
It's
want to
writing the
do. I don't want a
same.
machine to do it.
Yeah. I think you can kind of tell if you're a writer, you can kind of tell if something's AI. You're
Oh
like,
yeah,
okay, this is the same cadence of sentence that I learned in fifth grade. It
yeah,
also learned in fifth grade.
yeah,
But I think AI does, in some instances, take away kind of the boring stuff.
it,
There's sometimes in marketing, and you're probably really familiar with this. There's sometimes in marketing where you get the feedback that's like, "I'm just not feeling it," and you're like, how? Like, is it the color scheme? Is it the shape of the graphic? Is the language
yeah,
not right? Is it incorrect? Like,
yeah,
I don't know. This is from a SME document that I got, and I kind of pulled this, and I might have interpreted it wrong.
right,
And they're like, I don't know, it's just not there. And you're like, okay. There are times when I would throw that into an AI tool, especially like Copilot that had access to my 365 stuff, and say like, okay, these parts are correct, keep them in there, but reframe it as
right,
though you're talking to my grandma, and it would help me do that. And that
right.
was really tedious before. So I think AI helping do that
It's just that
is
AI needs an operator. I mean,
yeah, you have to know how to
it's
manipulate it.
artificially intelligent, but it's not artificially. I don't know what's the word. It's not. I don't know.
Intelligent.
It's not conscious, right? Like, it doesn't have a consciousness, so you can't actually.
Right.
It's a great. It has a great tool, like you said, to fix things or to modify things, but it's not intuitive. So
Yeah.
yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's what it still needs an operator. It still needs a human.
It does,
As long
yeah.
as
And
I think
you
we
need to
keep.
teach it to be human too.
Yeah,
So you could tell it, like, make this sound more human, or you
yeah,
could say, I need you to add more emotional language around X, Y, and Z. And then it's like, oh, okay. And suddenly it sounds like a human wrote it. And you're like, okay, that's a little bit better.
right. Which, funny, you have to ask it that, and so that's not a default. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
I should sound more human. Well, how would I sound more like a
Yeah.
canine? How about that? Is that
Yeah. And
better?
you're like, well, this is right, but it's boring.
Yeah,
It's
that's funny. You said something earlier I was going to bring back, was that you were working with a group and they had integrated their sales and marketing. So you were working in marketing, but you were also in tandem with sales, right? Which is not always the case.
no.
And quite often they're working at opposite ends of the boardroom table and maybe not necessarily in alignment. And I mean, my experience is more of that, is that, we're allowed in the marketing room, but we're not allowed in the war room where, where sales are happening, right? So we're allowed to talk about all this stuff and about the message and about how we're going to attract people, but we have no input as to, once they walk through that door, that we don't have any we have no input as to what's happening in there. And so I find more and more that seems to be happening, that the sales and marketing are actually working together, and sometimes they're the same person is leading both those traditionally separate
Yeah.
departments, right?
Yeah, and sometimes it's not even called, sales and marketing. It's called patient experience, or it's called, or retention, or, growth, or something like that. Yeah, I find that as a part of those strategic discussions, especially if I'm expected to lead marketing or lead communications in some capacity, and marketing's kind of a blanket term.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Marketing is not really a thing. You're in social media, or you're in communications, or you're in internal communications, or you're in, brand messaging, or there's a lot. There's PR, there's
a big umbrella.
All marketing, right?
Yeah.
But I find that understanding aspects of each of those and being able to add value to those sales conversations is crucial to growth being successful. And when I start having strategic conversations with some of my clients, my conversation usually starts with, okay, how closely does sales and marketing work together? Are they both hand in hand working towards the same growth goals, or do they have different?
Right. Is it purposeful and is it in alignment?
Yeah,
exactly.
Similarly, how tied in is marketing with IT? Mm-hmm. What technology is being facilitated to help support sales and marketing as a single entity, and does that exist? So building that relationship is really important. Building a compliance relationship is really important. How tuned in is legal to what's going on as far as your digital footprint and digital identity? Would they be okay with how sales is talking about the company, or does marketing need to help reframe that messaging to be more compliant? I think those are sort of less fun conversations, but they're vital to getting an operationalized program off the ground. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Very interesting. Very cool. Well, we're coming to the end of our time here, and this has been a great conversation. I'm glad we made the effort to make this happen. I want you to give us one more thing. Like maybe it's a bit of a gold nugget for people in the healthcare who are responsible for some of the marketing initiatives, or maybe it's perhaps a nugget that maybe can be shared with somebody who actually works in marketing and works for healthcare organizations. What advice would you give them around how to tackle some of the challenges of that?
Marketing in general is fluid. There's a lot of change that happens in what's considered good in marketing and what's considered, the way to do it. I think in the healthcare space, we tend to recycle the same things over and over again because it's hard to keep up with that story and still be correct. The way that you talk about a healthcare company is a lot different than how you would sell Red Bull, for example. Next week I could change the message around how my perfume gets sold, but the way that you sell healthcare is always going to be the same. So finding ways to keep that fresh is very difficult. And in our space, I think it's okay to try something and have it not quite land, because otherwise it's going to look a lot like recycled content, because it is. So if you come up with some wild and crazy harebrained idea, it's not necessarily too innovative for our space, even though the story itself is fairly slow moving. We can still be as adept and agile in our space in marketing if we're willing to take a little bit of a risk. And the healthcare space is a place of a lot of rules and a lot of regulations, and it can be handcuffs for a marketing creative. Right. And I would just say, don't be afraid to try. The worst thing that somebody can say is that they don't like it, or it's not going to work, or it's not compliant, and they're not going to look at you like, well, you don't know what you're doing. They're gonna be like, wow, she's willing to try it, and maybe that'll work. Like, let's see how we can make that compliant. If somebody says no, don't just drop it. You could say like, okay, well, how could I pivot the message then to be more compliant? Or in your vision, how does this look? Start asking questions and really be curious about why the no is no, as opposed to just saying, okay, well, we'll just go back to doing kind of the same recycled content.
Right. Pushing the envelope and having some stick to itness.
Yeah.
Okay. I like that. That's great. Awesome. Kerchanin, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed having you on the episode, and I look forward to hearing more about what you're going to be doing in the future. So
thank you. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Well, I really enjoyed my chat with Kerchanin. She is an experienced marketing professional who has been spending a lot of time in the healthcare industry, and I think she brought a really great message to the table today, and that is that the stories we have to tell around our products and our services and whatever else we're doing out there in the industry is that the stories aren't always obvious. Sometimes they're hidden. The story could be in the data. The story could be in the science. Of course, there's always stories in the people, but they may not be as obvious as you think, and you might need to do a little bit of digging. And I think it's a great message. Have fun searching for your hidden stories, and tune in next time. Thanks for listening.